40 years have passed, and one question still refuses to disappear. What happened to Suzy Lamplugh? Few criminal investigations have lingered in the public consciousness quite like this one. Every few years, the case resurfaces as investigators revisit old evidence. Journalists retrace familiar ground, and the public wonders whether the answer has been sitting unnoticed for decades. Despite countless interviews, major police inquiries, forensic reviews, and renewed appeals, the final chapter remains unwritten. Not because investigators stopped looking, but because the trails seem to vanish almost as suddenly as Suzy herself. By now, most people know the outline of the story. A young estate agent leaves her office for a routine property viewing in Fulham, London, on July 28, 1986. She tells her colleagues she'll be back shortly. She never returns. That much has become part of British history. What continues to puzzle investigators is everything that happened in between. Somewhere between leaving her office and the end of that appointment, the timeline collapses. There is no confirmed account of her final movements. No verified explanation for why she disappeared. Just a series of facts, fragments, and unanswered questions that have challenged detectives for 4 decades. To understand why this case has become Britain's greatest missing person mystery, it's worth returning to the beginning. Not to search for sensational theories, but to reconstruct the ordinary events that unexpectedly became extraordinary. Long before her name appeared in newspaper headlines, Suzy Lamplugh was simply a young woman building a career in one of London's busiest property markets. Born on May 3, 1961, Susan Catherine Lamplugh grew up in a close-knit family and was known to friends simply as Suzy. Those who knew her described her as confident, outgoing, and independent. She enjoyed meeting people, embraced new challenges, and had a calm professionalism that suited the demands of estate agency work. By 1986, she was employed by Sturgis estate agents in Fulham, an area where the property market moved quickly and no 2 days looked exactly alike. The job required flexibility. 1 hour could be spent answering telephone inquiries. The next might involve driving across the neighborhood to unlock a vacant property for someone interested in buying it. Most appointments were with complete strangers. Clients often arrange viewings over the telephone before meeting an agent for the very first time at the property itself. It was a normal part of the business, and nothing about it seemed particularly risky at the time. That routine would later become one of the greatest challenges facing investigators. When your work depends on meeting unfamiliar people every day, identifying which encounter changed everything becomes incredibly difficult. July 28, 1986, began like countless Mondays before it. The office opened for business. Telephones rang. Appointments were scheduled. Colleagues moved between desks, discussing properties and prospective buyers. Nothing about the morning suggested it would become one of the most examined working days in British criminal history. Among the appointments entered into Suzy's diary was a viewing at 37 Shorrold's Road, Fulham. The prospective client was recorded under a single name, Mr. Kipper. It was a brief diary entry, no different from many others an estate agent might write during a busy day. There was no indication that this appointment required special attention, and no reason for anyone in the office to remember it more clearly than the rest. At approximately 12:40 p.m., Suzy left the office in a white company Ford Fiesta to keep the appointment. The property was only a short drive away. She expected to be back after the viewing, and her colleagues expected exactly the same. Nothing about her departure stood out. No unusual conversation. No expression of concern. No sign that she believed she was walking into danger. She simply left to do her job. If someone had watched her drive away that afternoon, they would have seen an ordinary scene repeated thousands of times across Britain every single day. An estate agent on her way to meet a prospective buyer. The journey itself was uneventful. Shorrold's Road was a quiet residential street lined with Victorian terraced houses, the kind of location where estate viewings happened regularly. It was neither isolated nor deserted. People came and went throughout the day. Cars passed along nearby roads. Residents carried on with their afternoon routines. It was the last place anyone would expect a person to disappear without explanation. Investigators later established that Suzy arrived in the area as planned. One witness reported seeing a woman matching her description speaking with a tall man outside the property shortly before the scheduled viewing. The man was described as well-built, around 6 feet 2 inches tall, and dressed in dark clothing. Other details varied slightly as the years passed, something detectives had to consider carefully whenever reviewing witness statements. The account has remained significant because it may represent the last credible sighting of Suzy before she disappeared. Beyond that point, certainty begins to fade. No witness has ever been able to provide investigators with a complete picture of what happened next. No one has been able to say they watched the viewing take place from beginning to end. No one reported seeing Suzy drive away. No one reported witnessing an assault or an abduction. For detectives, those missing moments became the largest gap in the entire investigation. Back at the estate agency, the afternoon continued as normal. Appointments were completed. Clients came and went. At first, there was little reason to worry about Suzy's absence. Estate viewings did not always finish on schedule. A client might ask additional questions or request to see another property nearby. Delays were not uncommon. But as the afternoon wore on, concern gradually replaced routine. Suzy had not returned. She had not telephoned the office. No one had heard from her. What initially seemed like a minor delay slowly became impossible to ignore. By early evening, colleagues and family members knew something was wrong. For those closest to Suzy, the silence was deeply out of character. She was regarded as reliable and responsible. Failing to return without contacting anyone simply wasn't something they expected from her. Police were notified, and what began as a missing person inquiry quickly gathered urgency. One of the first priorities was retracing Suzy's final known movements. Investigators searched the area around Shorolds Road, hoping to establish exactly where she had been and who she had met. Then came an important discovery. Suzy's white Ford Fiesta was found parked close to the property where the viewing had been arranged. Its location confirmed that she had reached the appointment, but it also introduced an entirely new set of questions. If her car remained where she had left it, how had she disappeared? Had she willingly left the area with someone else? Had she intended to return within minutes? Or had events unfolded so unexpectedly that she never made it back to the driver's seat? Detectives examined the vehicle carefully, hoping it would reveal what had happened after Suzy arrived. Instead, it revealed very little. There were no obvious signs of violence. Nothing inside immediately explained her disappearance. The car appeared less like the scene of a crime and more like something that had simply been abandoned in the middle of an ordinary working day. For investigators, that absence of evidence was almost as troubling as evidence itself. Every missing person inquiry depends on building a timeline. Where was the individual? Who saw them? What happened next? In Suzy's case, the timeline remained remarkably clear until the moment she met the client recorded in her diary. After that, it simply stopped. As news of the disappearance spread, officers began speaking with residents, tracing potential witnesses, and reconstructing every known detail of Suzy's day. Hundreds of inquiries followed in the days ahead, driven by the hope that someone had noticed a face, a vehicle, or a conversation that seemed insignificant at the time. But one detail consistently drew investigators back to the very beginning. Not the property itself, not even the abandoned car. Just 2 handwritten words entered into a diary before lunchtime. Mr. Kipper. It seemed like the obvious place to start. Identify the client. Speak to the last person known to have arranged a meeting with Suzy. Establish what happened during the viewing. On paper, it sounded straightforward. In reality, it would become one of the most frustrating and enduring mysteries of the entire investigation. Because before detectives could determine what happened to Suzy Lamplugh, they first had to answer a much simpler question. Who exactly was Mr. Kipper? If detectives could identify the man who arranged the viewing at 37 Shorolds Road, they believed they could reconstruct Suzy Lamplugh's final known movements. It was the obvious place to begin. But almost immediately, the investigation hit an unexpected obstacle. No one came forward claiming to be Mr. Kipper. No prospective buyer contacted the estate agency to ask why the appointment had never happened. The name written in Suzy's diary seemed to lead nowhere. Detectives explored every possibility. They examined records connected to the appointment, spoke to people involved in the local property market, and tried to determine whether anyone had previously used that name. The inquiry produced no confirmed identity. That raised an unsettling possibility. If Mr. Kipper wasn't real, then whoever arranged the meeting may never have intended to reveal who they were. While one team focused on the appointment itself, others worked to retrace Suzy's final known movements. Officers visited homes along Shoreolds Road, interviewed residents, and appealed to anyone who had been in the area that afternoon. Drivers, pedestrians, delivery workers, and nearby businesses were all considered potential witnesses. One reported seeing Suzy speaking with a tall, well-built man shortly before the scheduled viewing. It remains one of the last potentially significant sightings, but it was never enough to identify the man with certainty. Beyond that point, the trail disappeared. There was no confirmed witness to an abduction. No one saw Suzy leave the area. No one could explain how a busy residential street had become the last known location of one of Britain's most famous missing persons. As the days passed, the search intensified. Parks, open land, rivers, and vacant properties were examined. Search teams followed every credible lead, hoping to find either Suzy or evidence explaining where she had gone. Nothing was found. The Metropolitan Police expanded the inquiry on a scale rarely seen for a missing person investigation. Hundreds of officers became involved. Thousands of statements were collected. Public appeals spread across newspapers and television, reaching millions of people. Detectives hoped someone would remember an unfamiliar face, a suspicious vehicle, or a conversation that had seemed unimportant at the time. Information poured in. Every lead was assessed. Many sounded promising. Almost all ended in disappointment. With no body, no confirmed crime scene, and no forensic evidence pointing toward a suspect, investigators were forced to rely almost entirely on witness testimony and painstaking detective work. As weeks became months, the investigation began to change. Police could no longer treat the case as though Suzy had simply gone missing. They had to consider the possibility that she had been the victim of a serious crime. That shift widened the inquiry considerably. Detectives started reviewing men with histories of violence and sexual offenses who had lived in, worked in, or regularly visited southwest London during the summer of 1986. One name would eventually stand apart from the others. At first, however, he was simply another person whose background required closer examination. The significance of that name wouldn't become clear until the following year, when another violent crime shocked Britain and unexpectedly gave detectives a new reason to revisit Suzy Lamplug's disappearance. What they discovered would change the direction of the investigation for decades to come. For almost a year, detectives kept returning to the same unanswered questions. Who was Mr. Kipper? Where had Suzy gone after arriving at Shoreolds Road? And why had no one come forward with a missing piece that could explain what happened? Then another investigation changed everything. On October 6, 1987, 29-year-old Shirley Banks finished work at an employment office in Bristol and never made it home. 5 days later, her body was discovered in woodland near Backwell Hill. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The man convicted of that crime was John Cannan. At first, the two investigations were entirely separate, but as detectives examined Cannan's background, they began noticing details they couldn't ignore. He had a history of violent and sexual offenses against women. He was known to manipulate and deceive potential victims. More importantly, he had connections to southwest London around the time Suzy disappeared and had been released from prison only weeks before her disappearance in July 1986. Those facts didn't prove he had abducted Suzy Lamplugh, but they were enough to place him under increasing scrutiny. Over the years, investigators interviewed Cannan numerous times. Each interview had the same objective: to establish whether the man convicted of murdering Shirley Banks also held the answers to Britain's most famous missing person case. Cannan consistently denied any involvement. Detectives challenged him with witness accounts, timelines, and information gathered throughout the investigation. Nothing produced the evidence needed to charge him. That distinction has remained central to the case ever since. John Cannan became the Metropolitan Police's principal suspect, but he was never prosecuted for Suzy Lamplugh's disappearance. No witness ever identified him as the man seen outside Shorolds Road. No forensic evidence conclusively linked him to Suzy. And because her body has never been found, investigators were never able to reconstruct the final moments that might have answered those questions once and for all. Legally, the case remained exactly where it had begun, unsolved, yet detectives never stopped looking. Over the following decades, search teams returned to locations connected to new intelligence. Ground was excavated. Woodland was searched. Properties linked to investigative leads were examined. Every operation carried the hope that the smallest discovery, a personal belonging, a fragment of evidence, even a previously overlooked trace, might finally explain what happened on that summer afternoon in 1986. None did. The investigation continued to evolve alongside advances in forensic science. Evidence collected decades earlier was re-examined using technologies that didn't exist when Suzy disappeared. Witness statements were reviewed again. Timelines were refined. Fresh detectives inherited thousands of documents from those who had spent years on the case before them. Each believed there was still a possibility that someone, somewhere, had missed something. Then, in 2024, one chapter of the investigation came to an end. John Cannan died in prison at the age of 70. For many following the case, it was a deeply frustrating moment. If detectives were right about him, then one of the few people who may have known exactly what happened to Suzy had taken those answers to his grave. If detectives were wrong, then Britain's biggest missing person investigation had lost the opportunity to question one of its most significant suspects ever again. Either way, his death resolved nothing. The mystery remained. And then came today, exactly 40 years after Suzy Lamplugh walked out of her office, expecting to return before the afternoon was over. 40 years since she climbed into her white Ford Fiesta. 40 years since an appointment entered into a diary changed British criminal history. Across Britain today, her name is being spoken once again. National newspapers have revisited the investigation. Television networks have looked back on the case. Radio programs have reflected on the unanswered questions that have outlived generations of detectives. And perhaps most significantly, the Metropolitan Police have made it clear that this is not simply a case remembered for history's sake. It is still an active investigation. 40 years after Suzy disappeared, detectives confirmed they continue to review approximately 30 remaining investigative opportunities. 30 possible avenues. 30 chances, however small, that one could finally provide the breakthrough investigators have spent decades searching for. The force has also acknowledged that modern technology could transform how cold cases are investigated. Artificial intelligence can rapidly analyze enormous volumes of documents, identify hidden patterns across witness statements, and connect information gathered years apart in ways that would once have taken investigators months or even years. Advances in forensic science continue to offer similar possibilities. Evidence that revealed nothing in 1986 may not remain silent forever. None of this guarantees that Suzy Lamplug's disappearance will be solved. But for the first time in decades, investigators possess tools that those leading the original inquiry could never have imagined. Perhaps the answer has always existed inside thousands of pages of evidence. Perhaps someone unknowingly mentioned a crucial detail years ago. Perhaps a connection that once appeared insignificant will finally make sense. History has repeatedly shown that some of Britain's oldest cold cases are solved not because of one dramatic discovery, but because one forgotten fact suddenly fits where it never did before. That possibility is why this investigation continues. It is also why Suzy's family have never stopped hoping. For 40 years, they have lived without certainty, without a place to visit, without knowing how her story ended. Most families eventually receive answers. Some receive justice. The Lamplugh family received neither. And perhaps that is why this case continues to resonate so deeply with the British public. It isn't remembered simply because someone disappeared. It is remembered because she disappeared during an ordinary working day in one of the busiest cities in the world, surrounded by people, and somehow left almost nothing behind. No confirmed final journey, no definitive crime scene, no explanation, only questions. 40 years later, those questions have become part of British history, but they have not become any less important. Somewhere the truth still exists, whether it lives inside a forgotten document, a memory someone has never shared, or information that has remained hidden for 4 decades. No one can say. What we do know is this. On July 28, 1986, Suzy Lamplugh left for a routine property viewing. She expected to come back. Her family expected her home. Her colleagues expected her back at work. None of them ever saw her again. And today, exactly 40 years later, Britain is still waiting for the answer. If you've stayed with us until the end, thank you for watching. Cases like this remind us that even after decades, the search for truth doesn't end. If you enjoy carefully researched documentaries built on verified evidence rather than speculation, please subscribe. It helps us continue bringing important stories like this to a wider audience, and you won't miss our next investigation. Finally, note that this documentary is based on publicly available records, official police statements, court proceedings, and reporting from established news organizations available at the time of production. Suzy Lamplugh's disappearance remains officially unsolved. References to individuals discussed in connection with the investigation reflect publicly reported investigative findings and should not be interpreted as proof of criminal responsibility unless established in a court of law.